Good evening, everyone. We're going to start. It is 7:01, but before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Marian Sacco, president of the Morgan Hill branch of the AAUW, which is the American Association of University Women. And we would like to announce at the beginning of this webinar, the 38th annual Wildflower Run as a virtual event this year, and it is going from March 20th to the 28th. And you can still register. What you just need to do is register on wildflowerrun.org, and you could register straight through until the 28th at 6 p.m. and win many prizes for social media posting during your own personal run, or put a team together. I have a team. We're going to put a team together and post on social media. We also would like to thank our major sponsors. You saw them at the beginning, and we'll share them again at the end. Our sponsors have been with us for many years sponsoring the Wildflower Run. AAUW puts on this run as a nonprofit, all-volunteer event, and 100% of the proceeds from the run goes to scholarships and community grants that are focused on education and equity. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Yvonne to introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you, Marian. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Dr. Stephanie Marie Howe. Dr. Howe has been ranked one of the 3 ultra marathon runners by Ultra Runner magazine and the International Trail Runners Association. She's a specialist in nutrition and exercise science, as well as a professional ultramarathon finisher, a coach, and a new mom. One of her many accomplishments has been her first place finish in the highly prestigious 2014 Western States 100-mile run. And she's also been the first place finisher in the 2015 Lake Sonoma 50-mile run that set a course record. So if you're a runner, or you want to be, this is your chance to benefit from Dr. Howe's personal experiences as a runner and her knowledge as an educator and a coach. So on behalf of the Morgan Hill branch of the AAUW, I'd like you to welcome Dr. Stephanie Howe. Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here and share what I know with you today, just from my professional experience and also my personal experience as a runner. So I'm going to try to share my screen now, and I have a little presentation that I can also send over after if anyone wants to get a copy of this, just for some of the information. Okay, let's see if this works here. Let's see if it allows me to do it. Well, not sure if it will.
You can share.
Yeah, I'm just seeing if I can allow the apps to share. Okay. Well, I might not be able to do that. Let me try one more time. Desktop, we'll try to share this. Well, all right, we might not get the the presentation, but that's okay. I can just talk. I like to give a lot of nutrition presentations, and lately with all of the Zoom, it's been not so many PowerPoints and more just me talking. So I'm happy to just go through that, and I can still send the PowerPoint just so you don't have to take notes while I do this. So
okay.
just basically, I wanted to give you an idea of kind of what I'm going to cover today. And I know nutrition is really, there's so much information out there, and it's really hard to know what is legitimate information and what is just made up. And so I kind of want to clear that up, give you an idea of the science behind the nutrition recommendations, and then also how to apply that, because when you read and you know the science, it's sometimes hard to translate that into real life. So what does that actually look like? So I'm going to go through an introduction to the macronutrients. So basically telling you a little bit more about carbohydrates, fat, and protein. And it's important to understand what they are and what foods compromise those nutrients, because that's how you eat. So we'll start with that. And then we'll go into a little more on sports nutrition. So what do you eat before, during, and after a run? And of different distances. So we'll talk a little bit about what those are. And then I want to give time for questions. I know a lot of people have specific questions that I might not cover in my general talk. So I'll leave some room for that. And again, these are just generalized guidelines. So if you really want specific, like information for you and what's going to be the best way to eat for your goals, your individual needs, your, demographics, it's always best to work with someone because it's just so different person to person. So keep that in mind as I'm going through these. So we're going to start here with carbohydrates. And so carbohydrates are the foundation of what we need as athletes, as healthy individuals, as growing individuals. So from childhood up to, elderly, carbohydrates are going to be compromised the majority of what we eat. Now, there's a lot of controversy on carbohydrates. There's a lot of, information about low carbohydrates, ketosis, and all of that isn't really based on great science. So I want to start by clearing that up. And carbohydrates are more than just pasta, bread, and potatoes. Those are the three things I hear the most when I ask people, okay, so tell me what a carbohydrate is. And although those are carbohydrates, they aren't necessarily the type we want to emphasize in our diets because they're more refined, and there is a time and a place for them. But when we think about carbohydrates, the most important ones are fruits and vegetables and whole grains. And I'm always surprised when I tell people that and they say, "Oh, I had no idea that vegetables were actually a carbohydrate." That I think they thought they were some other food group. And so that is the majority. That is the baseline of what you want your quote unquote food pyramid to be, or your way of eating. You want that to be the bottom of your plate, to be full of carbohydrates. Everybody's needs are a little bit different when we talk about the calories or the energy that is required for our bodies. And the best way to find that out is to, again, work with someone who can calculate it for you, because nobody needs just a 2,000 calorie diet. That's like the standard that we hear is 2,000 calories, but barely anyone falls into that range. You might be much higher, you might be a little bit lower, but that was just an average to give some context, but it's not a good average for most people. If you can't work with someone, the thing I would recommend doing is using a tracker like MyFitnessPal. And that isn't super accurate. I want to make that clear. It's not super accurate, but it's a good baseline, and you can use that to track progress over time. So it'll give you kind of a baseline idea of what your needs are based on your body size, your gender, your age, your activity level, and then you can use that to track over time. If you're ramping up for a race or you're in a heavy training phase, you need more energy. And so that will kind of give you an idea of what you need or what you're taking in, even though it's not completely accurate. But that's a good way to start, just to know what you're getting. So back to the carbohydrates. Another thing that is really mistaken right now is the differences between carbohydrates and sugar. And I want to explain that a little bit, because every carbohydrate that we eat is broken down into a simple sugar before it's absorbed into the body. So the end fate of a tablespoon of sugar and a carrot is the same exact thing. So when I hear about diets that are limiting sugar or I don't eat any sugar, that's actually not true. You might not eat refined sugar or added sugars, but you are always getting in sugar because that's what our body needs. So it's referred to as glucose. So as we eat something, we start breaking it down in our mouth. When we chew, that starts enzymes to break down the food. As it gets into our stomach, there's further breaking down of the food. So it's going from like a complex, like long chain of sugars, and it's getting broken down into smaller and smaller segments. As it gets into our small intestines, it's broken down into what's called a monosaccharide, which just means a single sugar. And that's primarily glucose. And that glucose is then absorbed into our bloodstream. And then it's carried to the muscles or to whatever cells need it for energy. So it's kind of important to understand that difference, because although you don't want to eat a lot of added sugars, everything that you eat in terms of carbohydrate, the end fate is glucose or a simple sugar. So when we hear of like honey or maple syrup as a healthier sugar than table sugar, that's not true. So you want to limit the amount of added sugars, but don't fall into that trap of like the clean eating or the healthified eating where you think that's a better option. The best option is just to eat less, but enjoy what you do eat. I'm a huge fan of enjoying food and not cutting out certain foods. So if you like ice cream, there's a time and a place for it. You don't necessarily have to not eat it because it's a sugar. So that's going to be a theme throughout here, is to not be a restrictive eater, rather to expand your palate, fill up your body with really good food, but then also enjoy things on the side. Okay, so that's sugar, and we'll get to sugar a little bit more when we talk about the before, during, and after exercise, because you're going to want to take in simple sugars during that time. But right now we're focusing on your day-to-day diet. So carbohydrates, we want to get them from fruits, vegetables, and whole grains primarily, but it is okay to have pasta, potatoes, and bread. It's a completely fine food to have. You just don't want the majority of your intake to come from those sources because they have less vitamins, minerals, and fiber, which are referred to as the micronutrients. So macronutrients are the nutrients that contain energy. And energy is what our body needs to be alive. So carbohydrates, fat, and protein are the macronutrients. The micronutrients are vitamins, minerals, and fiber. Water is sometimes considered a micronutrient. They don't have any energy or calories, but they're required for our body to function. We can't function without the vitamins and minerals. You can think of them as little helpers. So they're catalysts to help break down the macronutrients. So those carbohydrates, the colorful carbohydrates, have way more vitamins and minerals in them. So that's why we want to emphasize them. So how many do you need? So again, I said it's individual, but you can calculate your ballpark estimate by multiplying your body weight in kilograms. So usually we know our weight in pounds. To convert to kilograms, you divide by 2.2. So you take your weight in pounds, divide by 2.2, that'll give you your weight in kilograms. And then for an athlete, and I don't really like to say athlete, for an active person, you want about 5 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. Okay, so I'll say that one more time. So 5 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day. So you can calculate that range out for yourself. Now that's a pretty big range. So how do you know where you should fall? Yeah. So for females, especially on the smaller side, probably between 5 to 7 grams is sufficient. For a male or someone with a larger muscle mass, probably 6 to 8 grams is a better estimate, just because males tend to be larger, they have more muscle mass than females. Now, if you are training a lot, or if you're training for, say, a marathon distance or higher, you'll probably want to be closer to that 10 grams. And you can ramp up or ramp down your intake depending on where you are in your season. So if you're ramping up for your race right now, you'll probably want to be somewhere in the middle for like a 10K, 5K, 10K race. If you're in the off season, maybe you go down to the lower end of the range because you don't need quite as much. And so you can kind of get a sense of what your needs are just based on your body size, your gender, and then your activity level. Now, so we just talked about the absolute amount, so the grams per kilogram. You can also think about it in percentage. So throughout your day, you're eating different foods to compromise your daily intake. So about 50 to 65% of everything that you take in during the day should be from carbohydrate. Okay. So that's a little bit just hard to visualize sometimes. So the way I like to think about it is at each meal. So you want about half of your intake to be from carbohydrates. And since we don't just like have a plate and divide it in half and in fourths, the way I like to think about it is building a meal, building a bowl or a plate, and you're going to cover the base with carbohydrates. And again, remember, and we want to emphasize fruits, vegetables, whole grains. So I like to do a bunch of leafy greens, some roasted vegetables like sweet potatoes, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, kind of whatever you like, and mix it up because different colors have different nutrients. So lots of greens, some roasted vegetables, and then some sort of grain. Grains are one that a lot of people are cutting out or limiting right now. And it's really not great because grains have a lot of the B vitamins, B as in boy. There's B1 through B12, and they're all really important for energy metabolism. And they're tough to get from a lot of different foods. So grains are a really great option, and they're full of them. So leafy greens, roasted vegetables, and some sort of grain like brown rice, quinoa, couscous, oats, a corn tortilla. Those are all really great options. And so you're kind of getting a mixture of carbohydrates. And we'll get to what to put on top of that when we get to the next set of nutrients. But I want you to walk away from this knowing that carbohydrates are healthy and they're important. It's just you want to eat the right type. And for a healthy individual or an active person, carbohydrates are going to be the most important source of fuel. And this was where the PowerPoint came in handy. I had a little graph that showed this. But basically, there are two sources of fuel that our body uses during running. One is carbohydrate and the other is fat. And depending on how hard we're running, that determines the type of fuel that our body uses. So at rest and at really low intensities, so like a really easy jog or going for a hike, we're going to be using primarily fat. And the reason for that is it requires a lot of oxygen to break down the fat to turn it into energy. And so at rest, there's plenty of oxygen available for that process. It's a really slow process, but we have unlimited stores of fat. Even a really slender person, you don't need much fat stores to provide enough energy. As our intensity increases, so as we go to like a medium hard run up to a race pace, we're going to start using more and more carbohydrate. And the reason for that is carbohydrate is much quicker to break down. So it can happen without a lot of oxygen and it can happen very quickly. And so at a race pace, we need carbohydrate because we're going really hard and our body can't keep up with the amount of fat. And so we use carbohydrate. The issue with carbohydrate is although it's a great source of fuel and it's quick, we don't have as many stores in our body. So when we talk about before, during, and after, I'll explain why fueling or taking in energy while you're running is important. But those are the two sources of fuel and we use them together. So even if you're maximizing the amount of fat that you can use, you're always still using carbohydrate. So I also want to dispel the myth that you can be an efficient fat burner, which most endurance athletes are. and only use fat because you're still using carbohydrate. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about your day-to-day intake. You need both, but you need to take in more carbohydrate. Trying to think if there's anything else with carbohydrate I want to say. I think that's most of it. And again, I'll leave time for questions if anyone has any afterwards. So next I'm going to move on to fat, since I kind of already brought it up. So fat is super important. It's the most dense form of energy. So carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. Fat is 9 calories per gram. And that's good to know because when you're thinking about how much fat to take in, it's more dense. So you don't need quite as much to get the same amount of calories. It's also really good for runners because a lot of people tend to have difficulties taking in enough. And so it's a really great source of high quality energy. Now, there's 2 types of fat, and I'm sure you've heard these words before, but there's saturated fat and then there's unsaturated fat. And the difference is just how they're made up chemically and biochemically and how they're processed in the body. We need both, but we need less of the saturated fat because it tends to travel with cholesterol and it can build up on the walls of the blood vessels and increase our risk for cardiovascular disease. Most healthy people don't have an issue with saturated fat, but it's always good to think about the distribution of your intake. So keeping saturated fat low and emphasizing unsaturated fat. So what is the difference? A good rule of thumb is that a saturated fat is solid at room temperature, whereas an unsaturated fat is liquid at room temperature. However, there are exceptions to the rule, like avocado. That's an unsaturated fat, and it's definitely a solid. But for the most part, things like olive oils and avocados, plant-based, are unsaturated, and things like butter, dairy, and any animal fat are saturated. And again, one other exception is coconut oil. And I like to mention that coconut oil is a saturated fat because in a lot of like healthified recipes, they use coconut oil instead of like butter or instead of olive oil. And it's a great tasting fat, but it's no healthier for you than like butter. So if you're making cookies, do yourself a favor and use butter because it's going to taste better. It's going to cook better. And it's really no healthier than any of the other fats. So that's kind of the difference. And knowing that difference is important because if we go back to our building the plate, we've got our dark leafy greens, we've got our roasted vegetables, we've got some grain, and then you want to add fat to that. And you want to primarily add unsaturated fat. So half of an avocado or a homemade dressing or drizzling with olive oil. And fat is important to add to that delicious bowl that you're building because a lot of those vitamins and minerals in all of those colorful fruits and vegetables, they can't be absorbed unless you have fat. So if you have like a really great salad, but you don't put the dressing on it, you're probably going to be missing out on a lot of those nutrients because they can't be absorbed without the fat. So fat also tastes good. So you want to add it to make increase the palatability of what you're eating. And it's a little bit tougher to think of the amount of fat because it's so much more dense. So I just say add it to increase the flavor and keep it as a small amount. Like a tablespoon of olive oil goes a long ways, as does, like a tablespoon of butter or even a teaspoon of butter. So, use it, but just use it to flavor the dish that you're eating. For that example of how much, for an active person, it's about 20 to 30% of your total daily intake. So again, a little bit tougher to conceptualize, but just think about adding it onto your dish to make it taste better. What else with fat? I think I kind of went through most of what I want to hit there. Oh, so again, we can get to this a little bit later, but too low a fat intake is something that's common amongst especially younger runners. So if you have kids or teens going, even through high school or into college, you want to make sure that they are getting enough fat, because too low a fat can increase risk for injuries and illness. And it's just a really good source, especially for females, for maintaining the menstrual cycle. When fat is too low, that's usually one of the first things that happens as they lose their period. And then it can increase risk for things like stress fractures or long-term negative health consequences. So I always like to bring that up too, of just, parents of developing males and females, making sure that they do have enough good fat, so mostly unsaturated fat, in their day-to-day diet is just really important. The third macronutrient is protein. And protein is one that I think as Americans, we tend to think it's hard to get, that we have to protein load or try really hard to get enough protein. And in fact, it's not hard to get. We want to make sure we get good quality, but it's not necessarily, we don't need to take in a lot of protein powders or supplements to get what we need. So protein itself is not used as a form of energy during exercise, but it's more used in the recovery and in a lot of just metabolic functions of the body. So really important for runners. We often think like strength athletes need more protein. Runners kind of need just as much because there's constant turnover happening. So when we run, we're breaking down the body to use for energy, whereas lifting weights is more anabolic, so it builds up the body. So post-run, you have to repair all of that damage, and protein is really important for that. So protein's made up of, I like to think of them as little Legos. They're called amino acids, and you use those Legos to build up bricks or walls of protein. So different combinations make different proteins. Now, some of those amino acids our body can make, and so when we need them, it can synthesize them. Some of them it can't make, so we have to get them through the foods that we eat. So when we refer to a complete protein, that's a protein that has all of those essential amino acids that our body can't make. So a high quality complete protein is animal proteins. Animal proteins have all of the amino acids we need, which kind of makes sense if you think about animals. They have muscles too, and so we're getting what we need. Now, plant-based proteins, because a lot of people are plant-based or eat primarily plant-based, we can get everything we need. You just need to make sure to eat a varied diet. So complementing proteins, it doesn't have to be necessarily in the same meal, but throughout the day is important so you get everything you need. And I like to tell people to not overthink it too much, because you can look up, what does brown rice have, or what does lentils have, or black beans, and overcomplicate what you need to get. Just eat a varied diet. So plant-based proteins that are really good sources of protein are like beans, any type of beans, and mix it up. So black beans, pinto beans, white beans, if you go to the bulk bins, which kind of aren't really a thing right now during COVID, but at some point they'll be a thing again. You can get a bunch of different types, try them, see what you like, and just have them on hand so you can mix things up. Another good source is like lentils or split peas. Again, there's like red lentils, brown lentils, yellow lentils, so you don't get sick of the same thing. And then soy-based products are they're a complete protein as well. So they're one of the only plant-based proteins that have all of those amino acids. The thing about soy is it can be highly processed, and so it's not quite the same as eating a real food like a lentil or a black bean, but there is a time and a place for it, and it is a really good source for plant-based individuals. And so soy can be in the form of tofu or tempeh. That's how you most frequently see it. Soy milk, obviously, is a decent source, but it's, they add water to it. So it's a little bit less dense, but that's a good source to add in for plant-based athletes. So how much do you need? Again, the athlete or the active individual needs a little bit more. So the recommendations are higher than just for normal. Like if you look at the RDA's recommendations, it's going to be lower than what an athlete needs. So for that calculation, it's about 1.0 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So you can kind of find your needs within that range. And honestly, it doesn't change as much as carbohydrate does throughout the year, because if you're taking in less carbohydrate or less energy in general during your off season, you still want to keep your protein intake up because it's going to provide satiety or fullness. So protein helps to keep you full after a meal. So it's an important piece. The percentage is about 20. Oh, yeah.
When you say like an athlete,
yeah,
how do you consider yourself an athlete? Like my husband and I, we try and hike 20 to 25 miles a week. So are we more on the normal side or the athletic side?
No, you're an athlete. So anyone who does intentional activity daily or most days of the week is an athlete. You don't have to be fast. You don't have to go far, but most people are athletes. They're just afraid to say like, I'm an athlete, because they might not have performance goals. That doesn't make you an athlete. But if you're out there moving your body most days of the week, you're an athlete. That's a good question. So back to the percentage of protein. So about 20 to 30% of your total intake should be from protein. Okay. So going back to our plate or our bowl that we're building. So again, the dark leafy greens, the roasted vegetables, some grain. We've got like half of an avocado or some homemade dressing on there. And then we're going to add our protein. So if you're doing something like an animal protein, you want about 3 to 5 ounces, we'll say, depending on your energy needs. So that's kind of like the size of your palm-ish. I mean, you don't have to like measure it out, but you don't want to have something that's as big as your head. And you also don't want to have something that's really tiny. So, like palm sized is about correct for an animal protein. And that can be like chicken, that can be salmon, turkey. Red meat is good. You don't want to have that every single night because it's a little bit higher in saturated fat, but it's good because it has high iron. And iron is something that we need. I'm just going to explain what this is real quick. As athletes, you need more iron because iron is a component of red blood cells. And red blood cells are what carries the oxygen to our muscles. So we take a breath in, and that oxygen binds to the iron on the red blood cell, carries it to the muscle where it detaches and is absorbed into the muscle. And that's important because when we're exercising, we need the oxygen to break down the fuel into energy. So without enough iron, we're not able to get enough oxygen to our muscles, and fatigue happens much more quickly. And so red meat is a really good source of iron. And I encourage athletes who do eat animal proteins to have it at least once a week, if not more. Personally, when I'm training a lot, I do 2 to 3 times a week.
Yeah. Okay.
If you're plant-based, you can put on like half a cup of beans or lentils. You can do different types. Another really good one that we oftentimes don't think of is hummus. Hummus is based on it's chickpea. Another chickpea option is falafel, or you can use tofu or tempeh, kind of how you would an animal protein. Okay, so that's going to make a really rounded meal. And every time that you eat, you want to kind of do that little checklist of like, okay, do I have my carbohydrate? Is there lots of different colors? Do I have my fat to help me absorb all of those nutrients? And then do I have good protein? It's going to be different depending on the meal. Oftentimes at breakfast, we're not really going to go for like the dark leafy greens, but it might be more like oats and then banana and then maybe some like butter, or it could even be like milk with actual dairy fat in it, and then some chia seeds for protein, or an egg, or, yogurt and granola. Just making sure that you have all three, carbohydrate, fat, and protein, is going to be a really good way to start thinking about each meal. And you can kind of change it for your preference too. Some people feel better with a little more of one nutrient than the other. So just pay attention to how you feel when you eat. And if you keep a log, that's kind of a nerdy thing to do, but even just like a training log, or if you journal, just kind of writing down how you feel and what you eat, just in a general sense, you don't have to like track everything. That can really help you learn what foods feel best for you and what foods maybe don't feel the best. And that's going to be the best way to eat for your body. Okay, before I get into before, during, and after, are there any questions about just nutrients in general? Anything I didn't cover on the needs as an athlete or as an individual?
Well, I had a question because, you hear people say, well, it's how you feel. Well, what am I supposed to be feeling? Like I'm kind of a positive person unless I'm up really late. I eat breakfast. I'm happy before I eat breakfast, happy during, after. So when you say, how do I feel? It's like, I don't know. I love split pea soup. So if you really, if you find a craving for something, I mean, I don't know, when people say feel or listen to your body, it's hard for me to understand what that really means.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what it refers to more is your energy throughout the day. So are there periods of time where you get low energy, or are you pretty energized the whole day? You feel good, or do you feel like you need to take a nap at points? And then also referring to your stomach. And does your stomach get upset? Do you get gassy? Do you feel bloated? Does it feel unsettled? And if you don't have any of that, that's great. You're probably doing a really good job with the foods that you eat. But people who do struggle with having like an upset stomach, or just feeling like their digestion is off, that's where you kind of look to the food and like, okay, so what am I eating that might be causing this? The same with getting sleepy or just having a crash. Usually it means that there's not enough protein, especially in the morning. Our typical breakfasts tend to be high in carbohydrate, but not a lot of protein. And so adding in some more protein earlier on in the day can help prevent that afternoon crash where you feel like you need like a coffee or some sugar to wake you up. So more so those types of things than like your mood. Although I love your mood. I think that's great to be happy and throughout your day. Any other questions?
Well, I have another question.
Yeah,
Okay,
keep going.
so we were talking about, the general guidelines for portions of carbohydrates and proteins, but what about for young children? Because in our 2K run, we'll have children run. Is there a certain meal that a certain way we should be feeding the young persons? And then for old people, like I'm old, so should I modify things a little bit? I mean, does it vary for people?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. It does vary throughout the lifespan. So thinking of children, children are not just small adults. They have so much higher energy needs than, if an adult that would be that size. So they don't need absolutely, like if we look at the absolute amount that they're eating, they don't need as much as we do, but for their relative size, they have much higher energy expenditure. So kids need to eat more frequently. They definitely need breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but oftentimes they're going to need a snack because they are growing. Their metabolism is so much higher. And if they're doing activity on top of that, they really need to get in more energy. And so for an active kid, having a snack before or after, or maybe both, depending on the type of activity, is super important. And the concern, or I guess the thing to think about, is most snack foods are really unhealthy. And kids are, they should have things that they enjoy. They can have ice cream. They can have some snack food sometimes, but we don't want that to become the majority of their diet. So it takes a little bit more planning and prep, but having like what we would call healthy snacks, I just think real food, as much real food as they can have, the better.
And should it be more carbohydrates and less protein?
It should be all three. So they're gonna, like, the volume of the snack should be more carbohydrate, because carbohydrates are not as dense. So something like an apple with a little bit of peanut butter, that's a really great option, because the apple is going to be, larger, and then maybe you're doing like a tablespoon of peanut butter, and that will be giving them fat and protein. But they do need just more fuel, more food, more frequently, and trying to limit the amount of processed food. So not so many things out of a package. The exception to that is, say, right before they go do an activity or right after, something like a bar, like I just know Cliff Bar stuff because I've worked with them. So like a Cliff Kids bar, that's a good option because it doesn't have a lot of crap in there, and it's going to give them the carbohydrate they need for the activity, because kids are like adults, and when they're doing activity, they're going to be using primarily carbohydrate, and their activities tend to be more high intensity. So if you watch a kid, they sprint and then they stop, and then they run circles and kick soccer balls, and they're more high intensity than we tend to be. Whereas adults can go much slower for longer, but maybe not quite as quick as kids. So they're going to need just that carbohydrate right before. And then I think the best thing with kids, about teaching them about nutrition, because kids are really intuitive eaters. They eat when they're hungry, they stop when they're full. So just including them in the process of cooking, having them be engaged in their food and from process to eating. So instead of just always cooking for them and putting it on their plate, involve them and let them use their hands, because the more connected we are to food at a young age, the better our relationship with food is as we get older. So one of the most important things to do. And as we age, so the older we get, our needs change as well. So protein becomes more important, especially for older individuals. And so I'm thinking like 50 plus years old. And as you get older and older, protein becomes more important. And that's mainly to preserve lean muscle mass. So we tend to lose muscle as we age. And so taking in that protein is going to be protective against loss of muscle mass. And, I gave you a range earlier, like 20 to 30% of protein. For an older individual, I would say 30%, be on that higher end throughout the whole year. Same with that, 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram, be on that 1.2 grams per kilogram, because it's just going to be really, really helpful. And then another combination that's good, and this is more activity, but doing weight bearing, especially like strength training exercises more often is helpful, along with the protein, to maintain muscle mass. So the two together are really protective as individuals age. Those are the main differences. There are some micronutrient things that change, but those are really individual. So that's something to more talk to a doctor about, just making sure that you get all of those micronutrients.
Oh, okay.
And this is not quite related to age differences, but throughout the year, a really good way to eat is to think about what's fresh in season. And this is more on the fruits and vegetables side of things. But if you buy things that are in season, they're going to, one, usually be a little bit cheaper because usually, not always, but usually be a little bit cheaper because they're abundant. So they're not being flown in from like Mexico. They're more locally sourced. 2, they're going to taste better because they're ripe. And 3, they're going to have more nutrients in them because they're picked at their peak ripeness. So although you can buy asparagus in the winter, it's not necessarily a great idea because it's not in season at that time. It's just not going to be as good as if we got it like in April, in the spring when it's fresh. And the other reason I like to eat seasonally is it mixes up what you get in. So if you're naturally following the seasons, you're going to get different fruits and vegetables, and that just keeps it interesting for your palate, but also gives your body different nutrients. And I recognize that's tough to do, especially in places of like cold weather, or if you live in a small town. And the best thing to do if you have to get produce out of season is to get frozen options, because frozen are usually picked in their peak ripeness and then frozen, and they maintain their nutrients much better than something that's in a can or that's really out of season. So that's one thing that I like to do. I get frozen blueberries because I like them. And I just keep them in my freezer. And that's better than buying like the package in the middle of winter because, they're traveling really far and they're not as nutrient dense. So one good way to mix up what you're getting. Okay, let's go to before, during, and after, because it's a little bit different than your day-to-day eating. So the first thing to think about when you're fueling for your activity is what type of activity are you doing? Is it an endurance sport? And that would include anything that you can do for a long period of time, like hiking, running, cycling, where you're moving, but you're able to sustain that activity. Or is it more high intensity, or we call these adventure sports, where it's like strength training and plyometrics, or say surfing, or something that requires like bursts of speed and then a recovery. So a lot of kids sports would fall under that as well. So that's the first thing to determine, what type of sport is this, because it's going to dictate a little bit your energy needs.
Okay.
So the thinking about before, this is going to be very similar across each sport. You want to do your activity with some energy in your body. And so a lot of times we wake up and we go do some sort of activity. Although that's ideal for a lot of things, especially our time schedule, it's not great for our bodies if we don't get in some sort of energy before the activity. And the reason for that is you go to bed at night and hopefully you're sleeping 6 to 8 hours. So you're fasting for 6 to 8 hours. And then you wake up and your body is more or less depleted. There's no glucose readily available. And so when you go to do the activity, you're kind of just breaking your body down more. Whereas if you take in just a little bit of some sort of breakfast or a snack, you have glucose available for the activity. So 1, you're going to feel better. 2, you're going to recover better. And 3, the activity is going to be much higher quality. So you want to start with something in your body. Now, for a really early morning runner, hiker, strength trainer, whatever sport you do, you don't necessarily want to eat a big breakfast, because that is going to sit heavy in your stomach, and say it's like 6 a.m. You probably don't want to, take the time to put something together. So you could have something as small as a banana. That's a great option, or a little bit of yogurt, or a piece of toast with jam or peanut butter. And earlier, how I said you want to build your meals with all of that carbohydrate, fat, and protein. This is a little bit different. So right before activity, the most important thing to get in is carbohydrate, because that's going to be broken down into glucose. And that glucose we're going to use right away for activity. So fat and protein are okay to have in small amounts, but they slow down the absorption. So when we're eating a meal, that's ideal, because we want our blood glucose to slowly rise and be taken up by our muscles and our cells slowly. During activity, we want it readily available. So we want something to get into our bodies quick and to be used quick. So primarily carbohydrate with just little bits of fat and protein are ideal right before an activity. So, and that's going to be the same kind of across all different sports. Some considerations, you don't want a lot of fiber. You don't want as much real food. So this is where I think it's confusing to people, because day to day, when you sit down to eat a meal, you want lots of fiber. You want lots of dark leafy greens and complex carbohydrates and good protein and fat. But right before an activity, it's kind of the opposite. You don't want to have a lot of fiber because it's going to upset your stomach. So if you eat, just imagine eating like a bunch of kale and then trying to do like jump rope for 5 minutes. It's not going to feel that good. It's going to kind of just like sit in there. It might produce some gas. It might be sloshy. So you want something that's going to sit well and more simple. So earlier when I was talking about sugar, it's kind of setting up for this conversation, because sugar is actually ideal in this setting. You want it to get into your body quickly and be used quickly. That's the whole point of taking in fuel before and during an activity, is to give your body quick energy. So something more simple is going to be ideal. And there's a lot of sports products out there that make really simple carbohydrates or simple fuel. Gels and blocks are the two that we use in longer events. So say like half marathon and up. Shorter events, we don't really need to take those types of fuel because we have enough stored in our bodies after breakfast to get through it. So better options are like a piece of fruit or a piece of toast, because that's going to be more real food like. And again, the amount depends on the individual, but you don't want it to be too heavy in your stomach. You don't want it to be too little that you're running out of energy. So you kind of have to find that sweet spot. And the best way to do that is to just kind of play around with your intake. And when you kind of nail it, when you like figure out what feels good for you, you'll know. And more so, you'll know when you do it wrong. So start with like your normal breakfast, and you can tweak it a little bit, but what works for me might not work for you and might not work for the other person. So some people like waffles, some people like eggs and toast, some people like yogurt and granola, and you just have to find what sits the best for you. And the best way to figure that out is you want to be full, or you want to be satiated, like feel like you're not hungry, but you don't want to be over full. And so just kind of thinking about it will help you find that balance. So that's before. Now, during, as I mentioned, if it's a half marathon or longer, you need to take in fuel. And for the purposes of this talk, if anyone has questions, I can go into it. But probably most people are doing shorter, especially if we're talking about the virtual run 10K. You don't need to take in any fuel during that because you have enough in your body to get you through. Now, hydration is a different story. So if it's warm out and we're getting into the months where it starts to be warm and we're sweating a lot, you do need to take in some sort of hydration to, one, keep your body's core temperature cool and rehydrate because you are sweating. And for everyone, again, I feel like I keep saying this, it's individual. Sweat rates vary from about a half a liter up to 2 liters an hour. And so that's a huge range. And it's like, how do you know? Usually people have a good intuition of like, am I a heavy sweater or do I not sweat a lot? And if you don't sweat a lot, you're probably on the lower end of that range. If you do sweat a lot, you're probably closer to the upper end. And it's going to vary depending on the environmental condition. So is it 60 and breezy, or is it 90 degrees and sunny? If it's 90 degrees, you're going to need more. One way that you can calculate your needs, and this is a little bit geeky, but I'm just going to share it anyways, is you can weigh yourself pre and post workout. As long as you don't drink anything during, you can, but you just subtract that number out. But if you weigh yourself pre and post, you can see about how much you're losing per hour. And you just can convert that into ounces. And that gives you a baseline idea of your sweat rate. Keep in mind that's your sweat rate at those environmental conditions. So it's going to change if it's hot or if it's cold, but that's a good way to know kind of your baseline needs. Now, do you want to take in water or do you want to take in sports drink? And my answer is kind of a mix of both. So if you're not taking in any fuel, so you're in a shorter race, it's sometimes good to take in a sports drink because it has a little bit of electrolytes in it, which is what we're sweating out. And it gives you a little bit of carbohydrate or glucose, and it tastes good. You don't want to drink a really concentrated sports drink because that's a lot on your stomach to process. So I like to either dilute the sports drink or to take in one that's a lighter formula. So just a couple brands that I know that make like a good lighter formula. And it's not like a Gatorade Light where it's like a fake sugar, but Cliff Bar, Scratch Labs, and Goo all make sport drink mix that's lighter in energy, but it gives you the right amount. If you're in a race and you can't choose, go for what they have. It's going to be fine. But if you are carrying your own, you can just choose what you want. And if it is a traditional sports drink, just cut it in half with some water. And that's a really good way to get the electrolytes that you need. If it's really hot, you need more electrolytes. If it's not so warm out, you probably can just drink water. But I would encourage you to have some form of either sports drink or water when you're doing an activity. If it's shorter than an hour, you can usually get by without it. But if it's hot or if it's longer than an hour, you definitely need to rehydrate during. And this is particularly important for kids, especially in team sports, to have some sort of fluids available because they have different metabolisms than us. And oftentimes they sweat more, they get warm faster. And so they're losing a lot of their hydration through sweat and evaporative cooling. So just having it available, again, kids are really good at meeting their needs. And so if they're thirsty, they're going to drink and they're going to feel that drive to drink. So just having it available, like if you're at soccer practice or in the kids 2K, it can be available before or after, like at the start line, finish line, just so that they are able to get in some hydration.
Oh, okay.
So the other piece of this is after activity. And this is a little bit different than before, where I said carbohydrate was the most important. After activity, you do need carbohydrate, but you also need some protein. So they're going to do two different things. The carbohydrate is going to go into your muscles and just restore the glucose that you use for activity. So remember earlier I said we have stored glucose in our body, but just not a lot of it. We use it up during activity, and then the carbohydrate we take in after goes to restore it. So that's one piece. The second piece is protein, and protein helps to recover and repair the muscles. So every time that we do activity, we're breaking down our bodies, and that protein helps it to recover and repair. So the key part of this, and this is a little bit tricky, you want to get in your recovery snack or fuel or meal within about 45 minutes of finishing your activity. So let me just explain why, because I think it's really cool to connect to this. So when we're at rest, like right now, if I were to eat something, it would be digested. It would, be digested in my stomach, go to my small intestines, and then it's absorbed into the bloodstream as glucose. So this glucose is in my bloodstream, going to my muscles or all the cells in my body, but the cells can't take up the glucose. They just don't have the receptor on the cell surface. It's in the middle of the cell. So what happens is our pancreas release insulin. Insulin binds to those cells and causes that carbohydrate or that glucose receptor to come up to the surface so they can take up the glucose. Okay, so at rest, that's what has to happen. And someone who has, for example, type 1 diabetes, their body doesn't make insulin. So they take in glucose and their blood glucose just goes up and up and up because the cells can't take up the glucose without the insulin. Okay, so that's what happens at rest. During exercise, our muscle contractions stimulate those muscle cells, glucose receptors, to go to the surface of the cell because it kind of makes sense. They need the energy. And so they can take up that glucose without any insulin. And they do that throughout the whole activity. As soon as we stop running, hiking, biking, etc., those receptors are still on top of the muscle cells. And they stay there for about 45 minutes. So anything we take in during that time goes directly to those working muscles to help them recover. And by doing that, we fill up our gas tank all the way full really fast. And that helps us to feel better and to recover faster. If you wait until like an hour and a half after activity, then it goes to your entire body and requires that insulin response. So it only fills your gas tank up maybe 3/4 full. So the next time you start, you're just not quite as recovered. So I like to explain that so people understand the reason for that time window to get something in right away. Now, what to get in, that is a little bit more, there's more flexibility. So there's lots of sports products that are going to be like your recovery protein shake or this and that recovery. Those are fine. And if you want to buy them, that's okay. But they're no better than just a normal piece of food. So a really good one is chocolate milk because it tastes good and it has good carbohydrate and protein, like kind of the ideal ratio. Another good one is like a latte or cappuccino, because the milk is going to give you the protein and the carbohydrate, a piece of fruit and nut butter, yogurt. The most important thing though is just to eat something. So people always search for like the perfect option. Whereas if you're not hungry after you finish, having your protein shake might not sound that good. But if you finish and say it's really hot out and you're craving salt and chips and salsa sound great, go for it. I would rather have you get in something than to try to force down something that doesn't sound good. So get in something right after, hopefully within 45 minutes, and having it be mostly carbohydrate and a little protein. And the protein, again, just goes to help the muscles repair. You only need to do that if it's like a 60-minute run or, something longer than an hour. I shouldn't say run, whatever activity it is. If you just go for like 30 minutes, that time window or refueling right after is not as important because you have enough energy stored. You didn't deplete it. But anything longer than an hour or really intense, you're going to deplete your energy store. So the more you can fuel right after, the better. And this is true for all individuals. It doesn't really matter your age. It's just an important piece of nailing the after fueling to recover well. So night and day different between day-to-day meals versus what you take in before, during, and after. And I like to kind of dispel that myth of like, sugar is bad, I don't want sugar. Well, there is a time and a place for it. And during activity or right before activity is a really good time to have those simple sugars because they'll get into your body quicker. Whereas when you sit down for a meal, you want that nicely built plate or bowl that we went through a few times because it's going to take longer to get into your body. So start thinking of those differently. And the best way to find out what works for you is just to try different things and just kind of like take mental notes or actual physical notes of what feels good. And that'll help you figure out, okay, what's my good pre-race meal? Is it going to be oatmeal or is it going to be like toast and peanut butter, or, what is best for me after? Do I like to have chocolate milk, or do I want to have some chips and salsa? And the more you know about your body and what tastes good, what sounds good, what leads you to feel good after you eat it, that's going to be probably the best fuel or food for you to take. So nutrition is complicated and it's very individual, but if you pay attention to your needs after having some basic knowledge of what your body needs, you can really work within that to find those specific foods that are going to help you feel the best. So I know that's a lot of information, and it's complicated, but like I said, I'll send that PowerPoint so you guys can take a look at this. And then I am happy to answer any questions. I know, there was a lot of questions beforehand, and I'm not sure how many of them I covered.
Well, one of the ones that came up that you didn't address had to do with thyroid issues, and how a person with thyroid issues would, what nutritional needs do they have when they're doing activity?
Yeah, so thyroid is you can have hypothyroid, so it's not functioning, it's low, or you can have hyperthyroid, so it's overactive. And
they're gonna have low.
Low. Okay, so thyroid is tricky to modify on its own. Usually it requires some sort of medication to get it back into balance. But things that are important with hypo is to make sure to eat well, like to eat regular meals. Oftentimes it can happen for a lot of reasons, but it can be an overstressed situation. And by stress, it can be too much activity, not enough good fuel. It can be too much mental, psychological stress, not enough rest, anything that puts your body in a heightened state, and then it just doesn't get enough recovery from it. So eating really well-rounded meals throughout the day is important, not skipping meals. That's one of the worst things. Maintaining some form of activity, even if you're tired, just getting out and moving is going to be helpful. And then also another good nutrient is vitamin D. D is in dog. And I didn't really talk too much about supplements, and most vitamins and minerals you can get through the foods that you eat, with the exception of vitamin D, because it's really hard to get in food. It's not found in very many. The best way for us to get vitamin D is through the sunlight. So the UV rays are converted into vitamin D in our bodies. And that's great, except for in the winter months, or if you don't live in a sunny place, you're probably not getting exposed enough. Or wearing, like long sleeves or sunscreen, that limits our exposure. So vitamin D is the one I recommend taking a supplement for most people. You can get it tested, through just a regular blood panel from the doctor, but it's not going to hurt to take a vitamin D supplement. Even if you have enough, your body will just regulate it and get rid of the excess. So I do think vitamin D is a great one to take, and you can get really anything that's available on the grocery store or a pharmacy. The one thing to look for is vitamin D3. There are different types, and D3 is the type that's bioavailable to the body. So that's the one thing that I would recommend changing up with nutrition for someone with low thyroid. And then just being mindful of like how things change over time with adjusting medication. But being active is definitely going to help, even though you might feel tired.
Yeah, how do you feel about supplements in general? Besides the vitamin D, you kind of touched on that.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan because supplements aren't regulated by the FDA. And so a lot of times what's inside them isn't what it says on the package. There's no like third-party testing, which is kind of like, you don't always know what you're getting. And then if you think about like taking a pill versus eating like a big salad, I mean, you can kind of see the difference between like which one has more vitamins in it. And a lot of times, like the supplement, it can be the right type of vitamin, but it's just a different isoform because it's created artificially. So it's not absorbed or used in our bodies the same way it is through food. So I always turn to food first for vitamins, minerals, and then supplement second if someone has a deficiency. So if you get a test from a doctor that you have low iron, you try to increase it with foods, but adding in a supplement at that time because you're clinically low is important. So I usually only do supplements if it's necessary, with the exception of vitamin D, because that one is super important and hard to get.
Okay.
But in general, I think people waste a lot of money taking supplements that they don't really need. And just because, you don't need it and it's not going to hurt, we don't always know the long-term ramifications of taking like a blend of supplements. And I'm thinking more like, what you get at like a GNC, like a, fat burning or muscle building supplement. Sometimes we just don't really know what's in there and what it could do to your body long-term. So I tend to recommend foods first.
Okay. I'm going to look up this email that Leslie sent because she wanted to know.
Doesn't mention alcohol.
I have people here saying you did mention alcohol.
Oh,
Does
okay.
that mean you guys
well-
want an excuse to drink
Wine?
his wine? His wine?
So I started early in this talk by saying I think food should be enjoyable and you don't need to restrict. And I think alcohol falls under that of like, for me, a really good meal, I want to have a glass of wine with it because it's not a good meal to me if I'm going to, sit down and prepare this, luxurious, delicious meal. I enjoy it with a glass of wine. So alcohol isn't necessarily helpful. Despite the studies that you can read, it's not really going to be helpful for anything, but it's not necessarily bad in moderation. So you definitely don't want to have alcohol every single day because it adds up to being empty calories and it's a little bit hard on your body to process. But having it a couple times a week, I think is perfectly fine. Just being mindful again that most of your say evening calories aren't coming from alcohol. If you do have more than a glass or a beer, try to have water in between or match your intake with water, especially as we get older, because it dehydrates us. And when you wake up in the morning feeling crummy, it's mostly due to dehydration. So that's kind of my take on that. I'm probably going to go have a glass of wine after this, if that gives you any indication of, my thoughts on it. You can enjoy it in moderation.
Okay. I had a question just came in are there fad diets that you consider particularly bad?
I consider all fad diets bad because they're this list of rules that you need to follow that are usually arbitrarily made up. So the reason that some diets work is that they limit calorie intake. So a low carb diet isn't better than a high carb diet. It's just that sometimes people claim that they're better for weight loss because they limit the number of foods they can do. I like to think of your diet as the foods you choose to eat. So you get to make up your own rules, and your diet should include a lot of real food. It shouldn't cut out certain food groups. It shouldn't make things off limits because that's not how our bodies work. And when we do that, it just creates weird like relationships with food. So there's a lot of really bad ones right now. And the best diet, the diet I want you guys all to do is your diet. Choosing good foods that are fresh, that taste good, and that are going to nourish your body.
Well, I heard you mention, though, particularly for carbohydrates, is that you want a variety of colors. And that's what I've heard is that your diet should include as many colorful foods as you can get.
Exactly. Yep. Because colors mean different nutrients. And so you can think of that like in one meal, or you can think of that throughout the week. So maybe you make some broccoli You had that for a couple of days, and then you have some butternut squash and you make a soup out of it. So all of those different colors are so good for your body. And when you eat carbohydrates, do think of like eating the rainbow, not the Skittles rainbow, but the fruit and vegetable rainbow.
Okay. So this question came in, it had to do with a family whose husband has been taking classes with Clyde Wilson at Stanford in metabolism. Are you aware of this person?
I don't know if I am. There's a lot of researchers that publish as Wilson, but I'm not sure if I know the specific one.
Yeah, something about athletic performance and metabolism. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff in the news about metabolism. You know, they've talked about how people who were on The Biggest Loser and how those people ended up having, you know, their metabolism, I guess, was very slow. And one of the recommendations was for people who were severely obese and who now weren't or wanted to go to their regular weight, how they had to fast, intermittent fasting. So I don't know if that impacts the metabolism or it just is another way of lowering calories.
Yeah, intermittent fasting is a way to create restrictions. It doesn't do anything positive for metabolism. You know, people who are obese, they definitely have some sort of imbalance. So at one point in their life, they took in more than they used, and that created that imbalance. And then oftentimes what happens is they eat too little and their metabolism just goes down. And that just makes it really like this snowball effect of like, you know, the more they eat, the more they gain because their metabolism is so suppressed. Intermittent fasting doesn't do anything to the metabolism in a healthy way. All it does is create time where people aren't allowed to eat, so they take in less throughout the day. I'm not a fan of intermittent fasting for that reason, but also because it creates this pattern of like kind of starvation and binging, which to your metabolism isn't really ideal. So people can lose weight off of it. And for someone, when someone is obese, that's a way different story than we're talking about like a healthy or even an overweight individual. They can do a lot of modifications through just diet and exercise. But when you're obese, it's like a whole nother issue. And it's really, really hard to get back to like a normal function. So with Biggest Loser, when you're exercising extreme amounts and you're limiting your intake, that makes your metabolism just slow down because your body is the energy expenditure is so high and the intake is so low that it just shuts down because it's like, oh no, this is starvation mode, right? And I'm just going to shut down all things that aren't necessary for life. And it's hard to get that back. So it's not really a good way to eat or to exercise. It's just, it's boring. The way to be healthy is super boring. It's not like a really exciting, sexy option of like, just eat well, move your body. And we always look for, or I guess not we always look for, but people are enticed by just eat this and you'll be healthy, or just do this one exercise and you'll be healthy. And it's really not as simple as that. Or I guess it's not as easy as just like, you know, not having to think or don't eat all day. And then at night you can eat whatever you want. It's like, no, each meal you have to make good choices. Each day you have to move your body. And it's more just that cumulative effect that works over time rather than like a fad diet that promises quick results.
So this is the last question. So there's no way that food can impact a person's metabolism?
No, not necessarily, because different fuels, different types of food are broken down differently. So when we convert food to energy, our body isn't 100% efficient. So a lot of that energy is lost as heat. And so like protein, sometimes as we break it down, more is lost as heat. And like fiber isn't digested, but it fills our bodies or our stomachs up, makes us feel full, but we lose a lot of that fiber out our digestive tract. So foods do affect our metabolism differently, but it's not like you have to think about combining different foods to impact your metabolism. the best way to impact your metabolism is to eat regularly so it doesn't go through those periods of like high flux and then low intake. So we don't want that yo-yo, we want it more stable. And to eat all of the macronutrients, so carbohydrate, fat, and protein, in context of the right amount. So those ranges that I give, those are fairly important. You don't have to get out your calculator and figure it out, but just think about it when you're eating a meal, trying to get all three. And they do impact your metabolism, but it's more just your patterns of eating.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I know it's a lot. And I like to kind of, wrap up my thoughts with, there's so much, and I kind of went through a lot, but don't over stress about it. Just eating should be enjoyable, and yeah, think about what you're eating. But if you choose real food, for the most part, it's hard to go wrong. It really is. People get into trouble when they start trying to cut out certain things or emphasize like certain things, follow a diet, and eat things out of a package. If you prepare real food, you're probably going to be like 80% there. And then the other 20%, you just kind of think about it a little bit like, okay, do I have carbohydrates, fat, and protein? So don't overthink it. And every day doesn't have to be perfect. You can have some days where it's just not going well. And, it might be Cheetos for lunch and ice cream for dinner. And those days happen, but just don't let that continue on. The next day is a new day, and you just get back on to eating well again. And don't beat yourself up. That's the biggest thing too, is I see people feel guilty about eating certain things. And I really, it makes me sad to hear that. Like, when you eat a piece of chocolate cake, you shouldn't feel guilty. You should enjoy it, and enjoy it as a treat, and not think of it as an off limits food, because that creates that, binge and avoidance kind of routine. So don't overthink it, enjoy food, and move your body. That's big too.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Stephanie.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people were taking notes. I know I was.
Good.
I'm going to go home
and I
and
will
drink wine.
Good. Well, cheers to that. And I will send you that PowerPoint that I made, so you have that information. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was really nice to share what I know.
If you
Don't leave yet until we put sponsors on it.
Oh, and when you come down here to California, because we're very close to San Jose, and we have wineries down here too in Morgan Hill, south of San Jose. So when you go to Sonoma, you can pick up some wine from them, but come down here to Morgan Hill and pick up some wine from us.
That sounds great. I would love that.
Okay. Well, good night.
All right. Yeah, take care. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
I'd like to thank all the sponsors of the Wildflower Run this year. This has been an unusual 2021 because of the COVID-19. And so AAUW very much appreciates all the sponsors that we have had this year, as we've had in all the other years, and the fact that they've contributed to the Wildflower Fund during these times. So thank you very, very much. And I want to thank everybody who happened to tune in to this talk tonight. There was a lot of really good information.